Hi, I'm Pastor Kurt, and this is your 5-minute Bible study. Today, we're going to be looking at 2 Samuel chapter 7. This is where God makes a covenant with King David. Now, we need to back up a little bit and see how we've got to this point in the narrative. King Saul used to be king, but he didn't do what God wanted, and so God called David to be king. Well, of course, you can't have two kings at the same time. So King Saul spent all of the book of 1 Samuel trying to hunt down David and kill him, because Saul did not want to give up the throne. Well, by the end of the book of 1 Samuel, Saul ends up committing suicide. He's not successful tracking down David, and so he ends up killing himself. Now that the throne is open, David can rightfully take it. In this chapter, in 2 Samuel, David realizes that he's living in this wonderful place as king, and yet the Ark of the Covenant is still in a tent. Now, when you hear tent, don't necessarily think of like a camping tent that you'd use outside. This was a structure that the people of Israel carried with them when they were in the wilderness. Right? When you're in the wilderness, you don't have a permanent place to call home. So you travel around with these tents. And then when you stop for the night, you set up, and that's where you live. The Ark of the Covenant had a tent too. And David thinks, this isn't right. I, as king, have this wonderful place to live in, but the Ark of the Covenant is still in this tent. It should have a place too. Now, the Ark of the Covenant, of course, was the box that the people of Israel had that contained the tablets of the Ten Commandments, Moses' staff, and some of the manna from the wilderness. It was symbolic of God's presence with the people. So David thinks that God should have a place. In other words, David is thinking about building the temple. He tells this to the prophet Nathan. Well, Nathan then gets a message from God to deliver back to King David. And God tells Nathan, basically, have I asked you to build me a house? No. Instead, I'm going to build you a house, David. Now, there's a really interesting and fun wordplay going on here in this chapter. When David thinks about a house for God, he's thinking of physical structure. When God is talking about a house for David, he's talking about David's lineage, the house of David. For Christians, of course, this is important because Jesus is of the house of David. He is one of David's descendants. And so the promise that God makes here to David is that God will establish David's house. When we read this chapter, it's interesting to think of these two meanings of the word house. There's the physical structure, and then there's the lineage. When we think of physical structures, think of church buildings, for example. They are important to us. They are sacred spaces. This is where we come and worship and encounter God. The thing to remember, though, is that God is not just in that sacred space. But we need that sacred space. There's something special about this particular space. And so that's what David is trying to do here. He's trying to make this special place for God. And God's like, no, not yet. Your descendant will take care of that. Right? King Solomon, David's son, later on will build the temple, but not yet. Not yet. Right now, it's about God establishing the house for David. Sometimes we get so attached to our buildings that we forget that what's really important is the God who meets us, that the God who is always with us, the God who makes promises to us. If our church buildings were destroyed, we would still be the church. God would still be with us. Sometimes we forget that, or we ignore that. Yes, the buildings are important, but God is more important. God is always with us, whether we have a building or not. Just like God is working through David, God is still working through us today. God made promises back then, and God is still true to God's promises to us today. There's your 5-minute Bible study for today. Please remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.